Have you ever talked yourself out of doing something meaningful because you weren't sure it would really matter? In a world obsessed with scale and visibility, it's easy to assume that if our actions aren't big, they don't matter. Today, we'll explore why that belief quietly paralyzes us and how taking one small step can restore a powerful sense of agency.
Welcome to the Live Right Now podcast with me, Allan Haw. This is where mindfulness meets everyday life. Thanks for joining me for this reflection on living with intention. Let's talk about how we can live right now.
Hello, beautiful souls. I'm Allan, and welcome to Live Right Now. There's a quiet assumption that shapes how many of us think about impact. If it isn't big, it probably doesn't matter. You can see how that belief forms. We live in a culture that measures almost everything in numbers: views, followers, attendance, reach. If something spreads to thousands or millions of people, it's celebrated. If it touches only a handful, it can feel invisible. Over time, that way of measuring things starts to influence how we judge our own actions. If we can't reach a large audience, if it doesn't impact a lot of people, why bother? If we can't solve the whole problem, why bother starting? If the contribution is small, maybe it isn't worth the effort. The problem is that this thinking slowly erodes motivation. Psychologists have long studied a pattern called learned helplessness. When people repeatedly experience situations where their actions seem to make no difference, they often stop trying, even when opportunities for influence still exist. But there's a quieter version of that pattern that shows up in everyday life. It's not caused by repeated failure. It's caused by perceived insignificance. If we believe our actions are too small to matter, hesitation begins to feel rational. And when hesitation becomes habit, inaction follows naturally. I noticed this dynamic in my own work recently. This episode was supposed to come out last week, but I procrastinated putting it together. And part of that hesitation came from a question that many people who create things wrestle with from time to time. Is anyone actually listening? When feedback is limited or delayed, it's easy to start assuming the effort might not matter very much. And yet, when I step back and look honestly at the evidence, there's a different story there. Every person who's told me they listened to one of these episodes has said that it made them think or reflect or look at something differently. Now, the audience may not be massive, but it seems the impact for those who do listen has often been meaningful. So there's the tension. The scale is uncertain, but the impact is real. And that's exactly the place where many people quietly stall. The tension comes from a subtle but powerful mistake we make. We confuse scale with impact. Scale is about how many people encounter something. Impact is whether it actually changes anything, how someone thinks, what they understand, the decision they make next, or the direction they take in their life. Those two things overlap sometimes, but they're not the same. Something can reach millions of people and leave almost no lasting impression. Remember Balloon Boy? For a minute in 2009, there was wall-to-wall coverage about this 6-year-old kid who, his parents claimed, floated away in a homemade helium balloon. The story triggered a National Guard and police response, and it was everywhere. And then, gone, with no lasting impact on media, law enforcement, or parenting culture. At the same time, something experienced by just a handful of people can change the trajectory of their thinking for years. If you've ever spent a week at summer camp, you might know exactly what I mean. A single conversation, a moment around a campfire, something a counselor said. Those things stay with people for decades. Yet, culturally, we often treat scale as the primary measure of value. If the numbers are large, we assume it matters. If the numbers are small, we assume it doesn't. Once that belief takes hold, it creates a trap. If meaningful action must operate at a large scale, most of us conclude that our efforts are too small before we even begin. And that's where motivation quietly collapses. But there's another psychological principle that helps explain why this matters: behavioral activation. This concept is often used in cognitive behavioral therapy. The basic idea is simple but powerful. When people feel stuck or discouraged, waiting for motivation to arrive rarely works. Instead, taking even a small constructive action can begin to shift emotional momentum. In other words, action often comes before motivation, not after it. Movement restores a sense of agency. Helplessness tends to grow in inactivity. Agency grows in motion. When we take even a modest step, sending the message, starting the draft, having the conversation, we interrupt the mental loop that keeps telling us nothing we do will matter. The action itself doesn't need to solve the entire problem. It simply needs to move something forward. And once that shift happens, the psychological landscape changes. Instead of standing outside the situation feeling powerless, we become participants again. That's a very different place to operate from. There's an interesting example of this principle in a place you might not normally think about: sports marketing. See, back in the late 1980s, Nike introduced a phrase that would eventually become one of the most recognizable slogans in the world. You probably know what I'm going to say next, right? Just do it. And what made that campaign powerful wasn't that it spoke to elite athletes. Nike understood something important about their actual customers. Most people buying their shoes weren't going to become the next Michael Jordan. They were just ordinary people trying to stay active. Weekend warriors, people getting back into exercise, people who had good intentions but struggled with consistency. The slogan worked because it cut through the mental barriers that often stop people before they even begin. Don't overthink it. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Just start moving. Now, even though I wear a different brand of shoes, I often think of those words before heading out the door for a run myself. Now, obviously, a 3-word slogan isn't a philosophy of life, but the psychological insight behind it is real. When people focus too heavily on outcomes, expectations, and comparisons, they often stall before taking the first step. The solution isn't to ignore outcomes entirely. Outcomes do still matter, but action can't depend entirely on certainty about results. The same principle applies to many other areas of life beyond exercise. If we believe our contribution must reach thousands of people, we may never share the idea that could help 10. If we believe helping one person is insignificant, we may overlook the fact that many lives are shaped by exactly those kinds of interactions. Now, this doesn't mean that small actions replace systemic solutions. They don't. Large social problems require structural change, thoughtful policy, and collective effort. But those larger efforts almost always begin with individuals choosing to participate rather than withdraw. Someone raises a question. Someone starts a project. Someone helps another person. Someone speaks up. None of those actions look particularly dramatic at the beginning, but they all require the same first step: doing something. So let's bring this down to something practical that you can carry with you. Think about something that you've been postponing. Maybe it's a conversation that you've been meaning to have. Maybe an idea that you've been considering sharing. Maybe a project that you've been thinking about starting. Often, when we delay these things, the reasoning sounds reasonable in our own minds. I'm not sure it'll make a difference. Maybe it's just not a big enough idea to matter. Maybe I should wait until I'm more prepared. But you see, those thoughts often come from the same assumption that we've been exploring today. The belief that if an action isn't large, it may not be worthwhile. The philosopher William James once put it this way: act as if what you do makes a difference. It does. So here's a simple practice that you can try. Instead of asking whether the action will make a big difference, ask a different question. What's the smallest meaningful step that I could take to move this forward? Not the step that solves everything, just the step that begins something. Maybe it's sending that email that you've been thinking about. Maybe it's opening the document and writing that first paragraph. Maybe reaching out to someone who could use encouragement. Or just simply showing up and participating in a conversation that matters to you. Then add one more element to the experiment. See if you can stop hesitating and take that step within the next 24 hours. Not next week, not someday when life is quieter, just one small action in the near future. You may not immediately see a dramatic result. Most meaningful actions don't produce instant visible outcomes. But pay attention to something else instead. Notice how taking action changes how you feel about the situation. That shift is subtle, but real. When I hesitated releasing this episode last week, I caught myself falling into that same trap that we've been talking about. If the audience isn't large, does it really matter? But the truth is, every meaningful conversation I've had about this podcast started with just one person who happened to listen. The moment you act, even in a small way, you move from being a passive observer of the problem to an active participant in the world around you. And that shift matters because helplessness tends to grow in stillness. Agency grows in motion. So if you find yourself hesitating the next time you wonder whether your effort will matter, remember this: you don't have to solve everything. You just have to start somewhere. One small step is often enough to begin. Until next time, make the most of every moment and remember to live right now.
Thanks for being part of Live Right Now. If you like what you've heard, I encourage you to like and follow the podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform and share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. Join the conversation on our Facebook page or email me your thoughts at the address in the show notes. I'm Allan Haw. Until next time, make the most of every moment and remember to live right now.